Hi, welcome to the Nurture Nature Show. I am the Reverend Dr. LoraKim Joyner of One Earth Conservation and Ministry. I serve as wildlife veterinarian and Unitarian Universalist minister. During our time together, we will have a chance to nurture ourselves so that we can nurture all of nature. Welcome into this community of hope and nourishment and solidarity with all of life.
I'm the Reverend Meredith Garmon. I'm the guest host for today's Nurture Nature Show, and my guest is the woman who's usually the host. It's Reverend LoraKim Joyner. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you for hosting, and thank you, viewers, for attending today's show.
So, LoraKim, you have written a book that covers 30 years of your work doing conservation in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua in particular, and working with parrots to keep them safe from going extinct. How did you get involved in this kind of work?
I could say the words grace. And the more clear answer is that I have always wanted to work with birds that were endangered. Since I was a young child, I wanted to be a veterinarian, wanted to be a wildlife veterinarian, and had a particular affinity for parrots because that's what I'd grown up with as a child. And so when a call came saying they needed a wildlife veterinarian in Guatemala back in the 1980s, I jumped at the chance and packed up my medical bags and went down to Guatemala for 2 weeks in 1987.
You were just out of veterinary school at that time.
I sure was.
And you jumped at the chance to go and save the parrots of Central America.
Well, that was the hope. I started working with captive birds to begin with. I was working with a conservationist there that thought by breeding the birds we could alleviate some of the endangerment through the illegal wildlife trades.
What was endangering the birds in '87, and has that shifted, or is it the same thing that is endangering them?
I would say that the birds could probably make it almost with the habitat destruction and the pollution, but what is doing them in is the poaching. It is the illegal wildlife trade where people want to take the birds out and have them in their homes or in their zoos or their collections. It's decimating the parrots of the world.
And is that a change, or was that pretty much what you first encountered when you went down there in 1987, the first time?
When I went there in 1987, it was one of the first parrot conservation projects in Latin America of any scale. Nobody knew really what the impact of what the poaching was doing for the birds. And so I didn't know when I went there. I thought I was just doing wildlife research. And then we found out close to 95 to 98% of our nests were being taken. Tens and thousands of this one species, the yellow-naped Amazon, was being taken out of the country. And so if you were to ask me today, well, there aren't tens of thousands of parrots to take out of these countries anymore. They're gone. And of the primary, more charismatic species, their poaching in some areas, most areas, approaches 100% still. So it has not changed. We just don't have as many birds.
Now, it's called conservation in time of war. What was the war that was going on then?
The particular war was the Guatemala Civil War that really was through the 60s and 70s, and when I was there in the 80s and 90s. It was the government forces against the guerrilla revolutionaries wanting a more just government, and we were caught right in the middle of that.
And how long did that war last?
I'm not entirely sure. It did end in 1994. They signed an agreement, and that's when it, actually in 1996, that's when it officially ended. And so it had been going on for decades, over 30 years at that point.
So since the war ended, your work there has gotten a lot easier, right?
You would think. It's in many parts of Central America, it depends on the country, the region, are just as dangerous, if not more dangerous than when I was there during the Guatemala Civil War. We are back in Guatemala at this point, but we now have the criminal elements, and then we also have drug trafficking, which we didn't have when I was there. And so these are thugs and gangs, and it's a lot of money and a lot of corruption. And so in some places the danger is even greater than when I was there during the guerrilla civil war.
So you are in areas where there are drug dealers, and you're trying to make sure that the birds don't get poached. And do the drug dealers care about your work or what you're doing? Are you a nuisance to them? What's that like?
I haven't talked to a lot of drug dealers, and when we say the word that we use are narcos, narcotraficantes. So the short word is narco, so let's just go with that for now. And so I haven't talked to many of them, but we hear rumors and what's going on, and the usual pattern is the narcos have set up in areas of the forest where they're running their operations to channel drugs to come up to the United States, and they don't want anyone there. They are also laundering money, illegally squatting on land and developing it because they need somewhere for all their cash to go. And they don't want people in there watching them do that because they're illegally taking the land. So generally, they don't want any outsiders. They don't want any pictures taken. They don't want people putting their nose in there to show that what they're doing is illegal. So I would say as a whole, they're not really happy to have us there. And sometimes we hear of direct threats from them. And certainly the people we work with and live there, they do receive the direct threats.
They want you to go away just because they don't want anybody around in their area.
That's right. They're right.
So does that mean that they're also preventing people from coming in to poach birds?
That's a really, really interesting question, and we would need to study that again for each region. How does that work? There was a study in Mexico where the conservationists couldn't go in for a while, and they had to stay away because of the drug trade. And then they went back in, and some of the ranches were able to keep the poaching down even despite the drug trade. And in other areas, such as in one part of where I work in Honduras, the local people tell us nobody goes there and poaching birds because the two drug gangs are fighting so much, no one can get in there. But we don't have a systematic study. Maybe some of the drug people, and they bring in entire communities. And communities bring their families in, and no one can kick them out because of the firepower. And so maybe the drug traffickers themselves aren't taking the birds, but they have access for their families and people they know to come in and traffic. And it is true that through Mexico, drug traffickers and human traffickers and wildlife traffickers are often all the same person.
So the book covers a number of your projects, and maybe one of the more interesting ones, fascinating, is the one where you have connected to a small village in the Mosquitia region of Honduras. There's about 100 people, and they live miles from anybody else in a small village back in the pine savanna, in the woods, and many of those people were bird poachers, and you've connected with them and you've organized them into, if I'm understanding, into a rescue project. That is, they've got facilities there so that when the Forestry Service or the authorities are able to catch somebody poaching, and they've got a box full of chicks, where do they bring them? They bring them to Mabita, Honduras, where you have taught people how to take care of those birds until they can fledge on their own. There's a rescue operation. You've got some other operations that I want to get to in a minute, but tell me about how did you get the rescuing of scarlet macaws and yellow-naped Amazon? How did you get that up and going in a little village that only knew subsistence farming?
Well, it took some time and some commitment to do that. And when you said that I taught them, yes, I taught them avian medicine and conservation, but they taught me so much more about how to live in their area and what their values are. Because if you don't work with the people and their values, and they're in charge of the community, then you don't have a conservation project. So I first started going to that project in 1990 very much as a guest, just coming down for 2 or 3 days. And over a period of about 5 years, I realized that all their nests were getting poached, and that we could not rescue the birds. We could not stop poaching if we didn't have a place for the authorities to turn the birds over. So we had to have a rescue center, and in this village, they were doing it on their own, at risk to their own life. They were going in and taking the birds back, and they had to choose whether to feed themselves or their children or the birds. And so finally in 2015, I said, that's it. We have to raise money, we have to support this, we have to build cages, we have to bring in laboratory equipment. I have to commit 1 to 2 months every year to being in this area. And it is indeed true. Right now we have a flock of about 35 free-flying scarlet macaws that would have otherwise been poached and be in some home or zoo somewhere halfway across the world.
Do you feel like the authorities are more likely to energetically pursue catching poachers because they have somewhere to take the chicks if they get them back?
That's my guess. A place that is not corrupt and they're not going to get in trouble with because we're just farming the birds out to some wealthy people. So I believe that's true, but you can't draw that conclusion across all countries and regions. But they do seem more energetic because we have the research center there.
And another thing that you've done in that one village in Mabita, Honduras, is you've organized patrol teams. There's thousands of acres of pine savanna that they just walk through. And how does that help save the birds? What are they doing, these patrol teams of about, what, 3 or 4 or 5 people patrolling together?
Even on a given day. It's indigenous people and it's their territory, and it's where they hunt and they fish and they have their crops and their cattle. So they go out on purpose and they go around the borders of their property and underneath every nest that we have registered and monitored. And they're looking for people that shouldn't be on their indigenous property. And if they find them, they'll confront them, or they'll turn them in, or they'll confiscate the parrots or some type of climbing equipment. And so we have found, since we've been doing patrols part-time in 2015 and then full-time the last 2 years, this last year in 2017, only twice did people come on to this one conservation area, and it was early in the season before we got our patrols up and running. So we're suspicious that they figured it out, the poachers, and said, well, we're going to come in early and take the eggs instead of chicks because we know their patrols start at a certain time of the year. So they outsmarted us, we think.
And what are you going to do about that?
We're going to start earlier. And we also worked with the authorities about how to look for eggs, and we talked to the community leaders, and we're broadening out to the communities. And we have economic incentives for people in the broader community to protect their nest or to tell the authorities that they know where the poached birds are.
So the rescue operation, you helped get them set up, but that's something they carry on when you're not there. Then there's a patrolling operation which you helped set up and talk to them about, and they carry that on when you're not there. The third operation is one where you actually go to the nests, and you have people that have learned how to scale those long pine trees that don't have any branches until you get to the top. And what would you call this operation?
Nest registering and monitoring.
Nest registering and monitoring. Did they do that without you around?
Well, they sure do now. I have been the big driver for that as a veterinarian and to teach them to do that. And in this last year, I only spent a month there, and the month I was there, our project truck broke down. And so these nests are kilometers away, and they're getting there on motorcycles through the forest, and so I could not go. And they've been working with me for 7 years. So this year, they did almost all of the exams and weighing and checking for parasites and health and banding the birds on their own.
So you're climbing up the tree, you're looking in the nest, sometimes taking pictures, sometimes taking the chicks out to give them a veterinary exam and to band them and check on their health. And how is that helping?
Well, we have to know that the birds are there and why they die. We need to document whether they're being poached or not. And so we have to have close monitoring of the chicks. And then a lot of endangered groups of parrots, they have very small populations, such as these birds, and when you have a small population, they're really prone to disease and genetic issues. So we need to make sure that the chicks aren't also dying for other reasons.
Your subtitle says this is a transformational journey through beauty and tragedy. Have you been transformed?
Constantly. Constantly. I would say so. Would I have ended up here without those experiences through the the tragedy and the beauty of Central America, especially during the guerrilla warfare years in Guatemala, I would say I would not have been the same person, that what happened there fundamentally changed me to see the horrors of the world that I did not know exist. But I also began to be more in touch with the beauty of the people and the parrots there. And I would not have had that without the experience of working so closely there in that region.
So without the journey through both the beauty and the tragedy.
Right. That's right.
One of the stories you tell here, you tell about when some parrots fell to the ground, and it was a turning point in your life, and that was part of the transformation. Tell what happened when the parrots fell to the ground that day, and how it changed you.
Well, there may be two stories that you're talking about there, and they were both transformational. The first story was not that the birds fell to the ground, but that I fell to the ground. I was out in the around 1990 in Guatemala, and we were walking around the ranch, which they call a finca, and the person I was with was chatting about, he was Catholic, and his love of Mary and Jesus, and I was a little cautious around that conversation, wasn't sure what he wanted from me. And just as we got to the forest edge, one of the last remaining forest tracts in all of Central America, or in Guatemala that is, a group of yellow-nape Amazons, an endangered group of birds, burst out of the forest with the sun just rising in the mist, and they were squawking. And the next thing I knew, I was on the ground sobbing. I was not conscious, it just happened. But it was a fundamental shift for me, is that from then on, whenever I heard people talk about theology or ideology, like saying the word Jesus or Mary, it meant bird and tree. All of a sudden I saw that connection to meaning and worth and beauty, and it just opened up my sense of being able to connect ever greater to people and to life around me. And that was the story of when I fell to the ground.
So you had just, going back to the beginning, you'd just gotten out of veterinary school, where you had trained to be an avian veterinarian, and you got this job that you'd always wanted, to go right to the front lines of where birds were endangered and do what you could to save them. You did that from '87. By 1997, you were beginning divinity school. How did that suddenly happen? 10 years in, you're now a divinity school student. Does that have to do with falling to the ground and understanding Mary and Jesus in a new way? Religious
Sense or meaning. What is the meaning of life, and how do we connect to it? How do we find compassion in the midst of so much tragedy? And so all those stories came together from my many years of working in Guatemala, and basically I had to get out of Guatemala. As a veterinarian, I could not save the birds or the people. I did not have the tools, and I was really suffering depression and post-traumatic stress syndrome. I could not do the work anymore, and I felt I needed the tools. I needed to tap into the beauty and the meaning in life, and I thought perhaps I needed a faith community. I needed to learn the language of the heart. I was a scientist. I was a veterinarian. And so I came back to North Carolina State University to teach at the veterinary college there, avian medicine, and audited a class in New Testament theology. And I said, that's it. I need to know how to care for the human heart and my heart if we are to sustain this conservation work. And so that's what led me to divinity school.
And have you been using that training?
I did in a very concrete way for about 10 years. I actually pastored. I was the minister in congregations, Unitarian Universalist congregations, and actually did that. And my heart wanted to be back in Central America, but I wasn't ready yet. I was still healing. I was still growing. I was still transforming. And so after about 10 years of serving congregations, I started to put my toe back in to see if my heart and my health could take being back in the war zone. Even though the Civil War was gone, Central America and much of Latin America is still a war zone with the violence and the corruption. And little by little, I found out that I had the tools. I had developed, I don't know if the word's maturity, but being able to connect to the beauty so that I could be in a land of tragedy and still want to be there despite the ongoing losses that we still suffer there.
So you're able to keep up the work now because you've gotten tougher, or has the work gotten easier, or were you just especially sensitive in the 80s and 90s and less so now?
I would love to have people read the book and do a social psychological analysis and let me know what they think. Yeah, I'm sure that's what we'll be hearing today. Perhaps sensitive to the suffering, born empathetic for the plights of birds, and then going to Central America as a white suburban gal who did not know much about the rest of the world. I was really shocked in what's going on with people too in many of these locations. So I think perhaps I was sensitive. The work is even harder. There's less birds, there's less forest. But what I do is, in the course of a day in these areas, when I hear about a bird poached or somebody killed or trees cut down to take a bird out, it feels like I'm kicked in the gut. It still hurts. But then I breathe deep and I remember the beauty, and I find the spaciousness to say, I am here because I love and the beauty. And so I find a way to keep going forward. And then also do some practices and look for some support, because no one is superhuman and can do that all the time. And teamwork. I work with a big team of people, and they help support me to do this work.
I was struck by a chapter title toward the end called Attain the Good You Will Not Attain. What does that mean to you?
Right, that's a poem by Herbert Zbigniew that actually, you go back in my history, that we learned that together, that poem, where it says that, and it was about a war zone then, and that you will not win. The powerful, the rich, the narcos, the poachers, they will win. And so that's what conservation feels like. You cannot do this work expecting you're going to make any difference at all, because most often, or often we don't, and sometimes we do. So it means letting go of the results. I had to leave Guatemala all those years ago because I could not fix it. And so I, in some ways, felt like I abandoned the people and the parrots because I wanted results. I wanted to quit hurting. I wanted the suffering to end. But coming towards the end of the book and that memoir, and in the last 5 to 10 years, we do the work because we have to, not because of the results we'll get. And easing off like that, sometimes you really can attain results because you're not worn down. And you were bringing up the Mesquitia Honduras project. Every bird, every scarlet macaw that we see here, none of them escaped the illegal wildlife trade in 2014. It's a very threatened area. Everybody wants the indigenous territory. It's an impossible job. We cannot attain the good that we wish we would attain. But we kept at it, and in the last 2 years, none of those birds have entered, in our core conservation area, have entered the illegal wildlife trade. It's like a miracle, and I believe it's because we let go of results, and we just do it because we have to, and the birds call us to do this work.
So, by attaining the good that you will not attain, you are attaining the good that you will.
Right. Nice paradox, isn't it?
And when you say that there was not a single bird that escaped the trade, you mean that none of the hatchlings or fledglings that year made it. You don't mean that they got every single adult as well.
Right. In this particular area, they either climb trees or cut down trees to take out the young chicks, the babies, because they're very malleable and they're easier to take care of. They don't catch the adults. In this area, they don't. And so all those chicks either died from natural causes, which is a smaller percentage, or were taken out and then brought somewhere and shipped, mostly in the Americas, but they go to China, they go to Japan, they go to Asia, they go to the Mideast.
But all the adults were still around to try again the next year.
And that population has plummeted because there's been no replacement chicks over the last 30 years. This particular species used to fly all over Honduras. It's the national bird. And it's only down to maybe, I don't know, 400 individuals.
But there are replacement chicks coming along now, just in recent years, I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, we had 34 nests this year that were not poached. And then we have all the rescue birds that the authorities are bringing in that also are not ending up in someone's home or collection somewhere. And, you know, I think a piece that's really important here about the cycle of attaining what you will not attain, the Guatemala years were a disaster on my part. We accomplished nothing. We lost almost all of our nest trees to the conversion of cattle land to sugarcane. And we've just almost lost that bird. They say desaparecido, they have disappeared. But the work there, even though it didn't work there yet, went on to influence the next generation of parrot conservationists and informs me to be able to return to these countries and be a little smarter, a little brighter, and we're making a difference in a number of areas. And it goes back to those failures in the 1980s and 90s.
I noticed that the last chapter is called Conservation in Time of Peace. So, the war's over?
The war is not over.
Ah.
It's worse than ever before. I am alluding to that, to the inner peace, what we were just talking about. Is how can you be with tragedy? How can you let go of results? How can you have an inner peace so we have the resilience and the strength to be in communities of solidarity and resistance to do this very difficult work. And so we must look for inner peace if we want outer peace in our world.
And for people here in America who might read your book and are never going to go climb trees in the midst of guerrilla warfare like you did, what is it that they can do to help this planet have parrots, macaws, and winged beauty on into the years to come?
What can they do? I think they can just love themselves. To see the beauty within, the peace within, and how there is no separation between us and parrots and forests and people in other lands. And with that sense of connection, we suffer when our siblings of all kinds suffer. And so we are motivated to do something, but we're also connected in beauty, so we have the resources to do that. So work on your inner peace. You know, it's a great way to go. And if you particularly want to help an area, realize that these projects are 2 to 3 generations in length, and you really can turn around cultures and populations of birds. And so go in for the long haul. Pick a project, be relational, contribute in money or knowledge, and spread the word. Get this book and have other people read it. Be aware of the issues that we're about ready to lose our parrots.
It's a fascinating story and a fascinating book, Conservation in a Time of War by LoraKim Joyner. It's available now on Amazon. Pick up your copy soon.
That's right. And if you go to our website, we have reflection questions if you want to be able to use it in a book club. And
the One Earth Conservation
One
website.
Earth Conservation, and you can get all those connections of where to buy it in Amazon when we're done here and after the credits scroll. We also have reflection questions here. We have suggested actions that you'll be seeing soon and ways that you can get involved in conservation. Please join us. And thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.